They took the gold because it looked valuable, not because they understood what it was, and by the time they realized the difference, the desert had already started remembering their names. The tooth rolled once across the wooden table, slow, deliberate, as if nudged by a hand no one could see, and then it stopped at the edge, catching what little lantern light remained in the room. Though it did not shine the way gold should, it swallowed the glow instead, dimming the flame, turning the air heavier than it had any right to be inside a place built for men who feared nothing they could hold. Ethan Cole noticed it first, not because he believed in signs, but because he believed in ownership, and that tooth, pried clean from a dead man's jaw just hours ago beneath a sky stretched wide over 30 miles of empty land, had been in his pocket, not on the table, not moving on its own, not drawing silence out of a room that had never known how to stay quiet. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned back in his chair, boots planted firm on the floorboards, eyes fixed, measuring, weighing, the way a man does when he's deciding if something is worth more than it should be. Around him, the others kept talking, low voices, dry laughter, the scrape of tin cups against wood, but it all felt distant now, like sound traveling from somewhere far off, somewhere that didn't belong to this moment. Outside, the wind had stopped, not faded, not shifted, just stopped, as if the land itself had paused to listen. Mara Nachee stood in the doorway, unmoving, her silhouette framed by the last line of fading dusk, and she did not step inside, not even when Ethan's gaze found her, not even when the men behind him fell one by one into that same uneasy quiet. She had warned them before the sun dropped, said it plain, said it once, said it in a voice that didn't ask to be believed, only heard. But men like Ethan didn't build their lives on warnings. They built them on what they could take and keep, and the dead man in the sand had offered no resistance, no claim, no voice to stop the blade or the hand or the choice that followed. Ethan reached forward now, slow, deliberate, fingers closing around the tooth, expecting weight, expecting something solid, something real, but it felt colder than it should, not like metal left in night air, but like something that had never known warmth at all, and for just a second, barely long enough to name it, something in his chest tightened, not fear, not yet, just the sense that he had crossed a line he hadn't seen when he stepped over it. He glanced back toward Mara, and she met his eyes without moving, without blinking, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't loud, it didn't need to be, because the room was already listening. "You didn't take gold," she said, her voice carrying steady as stone. "You took something that was waiting to be returned." And somewhere beyond the walls, out past the last fence and into the open stretch where the land forgot your name as soon as you left it, something shifted, not in sound, not in sight, but in the space between both, like a shadow deciding it no longer needed the light to exist. The lantern burned lower without flicker, as if the flame itself had grown tired of holding on, and the air inside the room thickened in a way no man could quite explain, but every man could feel settling behind his ribs, slow and patient, like something taking its time learning how to breathe. Ethan Cole turned the tooth over in his palm, once, then again, watching how it refused the light, how it seemed to pull the glow inward instead of giving anything back, and for the first time since he had pried it free out there under that endless stretch of sky, he wondered why a man would carry something like this into death instead of leaving it behind where it could be found and sold and forgotten. Across the table, Jonah Briggs let out a short laugh that did not belong to him. Too sharp, too quick, and it died just as fast, like he had surprised himself by making it. And he rubbed the back of his neck as if trying to shake off a chill that had not been there a minute ago. "It is just gold," Jonah said, but he did not sound convinced, not even to his own ears, and no one answered him because the word just had no place in that room anymore. Outside, the night had settled in fully now, but it was not the kind of night men in Dry Creek were used to. There were no insects, no distant hooves, no wind pressing dust against the walls, only a stillness that felt measured, like something waiting for a signal no one had given yet. Mara remained in the doorway, her presence as steady as the earth beneath them, and when Ethan finally pushed himself to his feet, boots scraping against the floor, she did not move aside, did not step forward. She only watched him the way someone watches a man walk toward a decision that cannot be undone. "You should put it back," she said, quiet, certain, Not a suggestion, not a warning anymore, something closer to fact. Ethan gave a small shake of his head, not out of defiance, but out of habit, the kind that had carried him across bad seasons and worse land, the kind that told him if something could be held, it could be kept. It was lying in the sand, he said, his voice steady but slower now, as if each word had to find its way through something heavier than air, and no one came to claim it. Mara's eyes did not leave his. It was already claimed. The words settled between them, and for a long moment, no one spoke, no one moved, until a sound came from the far side of the room, soft at first, like fabric brushing against wood, then clearer, deliberate, the scrape of something shifting where nothing should have been moving at all. Jonah turned toward it, his chair creaking under the sudden motion, and the others followed, their attention pulled without choice to the dark corner near the back wall where the lantern light could not quite reach. There was nothing there, not at first glance, just shadow layered on shadow. But then one of the men, a young hand named Ellis, leaned forward slightly and whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to the space itself, "Did you hear that?" No one answered him, not because they had not heard it, but because each of them had heard something different, a voice maybe, or a memory, or a sound that did not belong to this room, and none of them trusted it enough to give it shape. Ethan felt it then, not in his ears, but somewhere deeper, like a word forming without language, and he closed his fingers tighter around the tooth, as if holding it could anchor him to something solid, something real, but the weight in his hand did not feel like gold anymore. It felt like a promise, and not the kind a man makes, the kind a man answers for, whether he meant to or not. The sound did not come again, not the same way, not from the same place, but something had already shifted, and every man in that room knew it without needing to look at each other for confirmation, the kind of knowing that settles in the spine and refuses to leave. Ethan loosened his grip just enough to look at the tooth again, holding it closer to the lantern, testing it like he would test any piece of metal worth weighing. But the closer he brought it to the flame, the dimmer the light became, until the edge of the table fell into shadow and the outlines of the men across from him softened like they were being pulled further away without moving an inch. "Put that thing down," Jonas said, quieter now, not a joke in his voice anymore, just a request that sounded too close to a plea, and Ethan glanced up at him, measuring, reading the man the same way he always did, except tonight the signs did not line up. Jonah's eyes were not on the tooth. They were fixed somewhere behind Ethan, somewhere near the door. Ethan turned, slow, controlled, expecting Mara still standing there, steady as before, but the doorway was empty now, the night beyond it deeper than it should have been, stretching farther than the few yards to the hitching post, as if the distance itself had lengthened without permission. "She leave?" Ellis asked, his voice thin, and no one answered because none of them had seen her go. Not a step, not a shadow crossing the threshold, just gone, like a thought that slips away before you can hold it still. The silence that followed was not the same as before. It was not waiting anymore. It was listening, and it pressed in from every side, from the walls, from the floorboards, from the space above their heads where the ceiling should have held firm but now felt too far away. Then came the voice. Soft, almost familiar, not loud enough to carry across the room, but close enough that each man heard it as if it had been meant for him alone, and Ethan felt it first as a shape rather than a sound, something forming just at the edge of understanding. "Ethan." He froze, not because he was afraid, not yet, but because no one in that room had spoken his name, not like that, not in a tone that carried weight without force. He looked around, quick now, sharper than before, and saw the same confusion mirrored back at him, men shifting in their seats, hands tightening around cups, eyes searching for a speaker that did not exist. "You hear that?" Ellis whispered again, but this time his voice trembled, and Jonah shook his head too fast, like denying it could push it away. Ethan stood, the chair legs scraping hard against the floor, and stepped toward the doorway, the tooth still in his hand, though he no longer remembered deciding to keep holding it. Outside, the air felt wrong, not cold, not warm, just absent, like something essential had been taken out of it, and the ground stretched out in that familiar sweep of dry land and scattered brush, but the horizon looked closer than it should, pressed in, watching. Another voice came, not calling his name this time, just a fragment, a phrase that did not belong to any memory he recognized, and yet it carried the weight of something personal, something taken and turned over and handed back in a way that did not feel like giving. Behind him, one of the men let out a sharp breath, and another muttered under his breath, but the words did not hold meaning. They slipped apart as soon as they were spoken. Ethan looked down at the tooth once more, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw something reflected in its surface, not his face, not the lantern light, but a movement, slow and patient, like a shadow that did not need a body to follow. And it was then, standing between the doorway and the open dark, that he understood something had begun, not when the voice called, not when the sound came from the corner, but the moment he chose to take what had never been offered, and whatever was coming now was not here to chase, it was here to collect. The desert did not move, not in any way a man could point to, but Ethan felt it shifting all the same, like the land itself had leaned in closer, narrowing the space between him and whatever waited beyond the reach of the porch light. And for the first time since he stepped outside, he did not feel alone in that open stretch of earth. Behind him, the door creaked once as Jonah pushed it wider, the weak glow of the lantern spilling out just enough to carve a thin line between inside and out. But it did not reach far, not even 10 feet past the wooden steps, and everything beyond that line looked wrong, not darker, not hidden, just distant in a way that did not match the ground he had walked 100 times before. "Ethan," Jonah said again, but this time it was his own voice, strained, uncertain, and Ethan turned halfway back, enough to see the man standing there with one hand on the frame, like he was holding himself in place more than the door. "We should leave," Jonah added, and that word should hung heavier than any command, because men like them did not leave what they had taken, not without reason, not without force, and yet it was the first sensible thing anyone had said since the sun went down. Ethan looked back out at the land, at the low rise of dirt about 40 yards out where they had first seen the body, where the sand had shifted just enough to catch the eye, and now that same patch looked closer than it should, like it had crept in while no one was watching, like distance had lost its rules. He took a step forward, slow, testing, his boot pressing into the dry ground that felt firmer than before, less like dust and more like packed earth after rain, though there had been no rain for weeks, and the air carried no scent of moisture, only something faint, something like old smoke that had settled too long in one place. "Do not walk further," a voice said from his right, calm, steady, and Ethan turned sharply, finding Mara standing there where there had been nothing a moment ago, not 10 feet from him, her outline clear against the dark but untouched by it, as if the night had decided not to reach her. "You did not see me come," she said, not as a question, just as truth, and Ethan did not answer because there was nothing to argue, nothing to deny. "It is closer now," she continued, her gaze shifting past him toward the open land, and Ethan followed that line of sight, trying to see what she saw, but all he found was that same stretch of ground, quiet, empty, waiting. "What is closer?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the edge it had carried before, and Mara looked at him for a long moment before answering. "What remembers?" The words settled in the space between them, heavier than anything that had been said so far, and Ethan felt the tooth in his hand grow colder, not in temperature, but in presence, like it was no longer just something he held, but something that held him in return. From behind him, Ellis stumbled out onto the porch, his breathing uneven, his eyes wide in a way that did not belong to a man who had only been sitting at a table minutes ago. "I heard my mother," he said, the words breaking as they came. "She has been gone 10 years, and I heard her calling me from the back wall like she was standing right there." No one answered him, not because they did not believe him, but because each of them had begun to understand that what they were hearing was not meant to be shared, not meant to be compared. It was being given to them one by one, shaped to fit something only they carried. Ethan looked down at the tooth again, and this time he did not try to weigh it, did not try to measure its worth. He only stared at the way it seemed to darken the lines of his hand, and for the first time, the thought came clear, uninvited and certain, that this was not something he had taken. This was something that had allowed itself to be taken, and whatever stood out there beyond the reach of light was not following them at all. It was waiting for them to understand why. The wind did not return, Not even a whisper across the dry brush or the loose boards of the porch, and that absence began to feel louder than any storm Ethan had ever ridden through, because out here, silence was never empty. It always carried something with it, and tonight it carried attention. Ethan closed his hand around the tooth again, slower this time, not to claim it, but to steady himself against the weight that seemed to grow with every passing second. And when he lifted his eyes from it, the land had shifted again, not in distance alone, but in shape. The low rise of dirt no longer a simple mound, but something more defined, like a place that had been waiting to be recognized. "You feel it now," Mara said quietly, her voice cutting through the stillness without disturbing it. And Ethan did not answer because there was no point pretending otherwise, not when the ground beneath his boots felt less like earth and more like something holding its breath. Behind him, Jonah stepped down from the porch, one careful step at a time, as if the boards might give way beneath him, though they never had before, and Ellis stayed near the doorway, unwilling to come closer, his eyes fixed on the open dark like it might speak again if he listened too closely. "We can ride out," Jonas said, not looking at Ethan, not looking at Mara, just staring out toward the line where the land met the sky. Except that line no longer looked like a horizon. It looked like a boundary, one that had already been crossed. Mara shook her head once, slow, certain. "You can leave the place," she said, "but not what has been taken." The words settled deep, and Ethan felt them land somewhere he could not push away, because this was no longer about distance or direction. It was about something that had already been set in motion. A sound came then, not from the distance, not from the town, but from just beyond that low rise, soft at first, like footsteps pressed into dry earth, but without rhythm, without pattern, as if each step belonged to a different memory instead of a single path. Ethan narrowed his eyes, trying to fix it, trying to make sense of it the way he would track cattle or follow a trail, but there was nothing to read, no prints, no broken brush, just the feeling of movement without sign. "It is not chasing you," Mara said, her voice steady, almost gentle now. "It is waiting for you to stop running." Ethan let out a slow breath, though he did not remember deciding to, and for a moment, everything narrowed down to the space between his hand and the tooth, the way it rested there like it had always belonged, and that thought unsettled him more than anything else. "What does it want?" he asked, not looking at her, not looking away from that rise in the land that now felt closer than 20 yards, closer than 10, though his feet had not moved. Mara's answer came without pause. "Not want," she said. "Balance." The word lingered, heavier than before, and Ethan felt something inside him shift with it. Not fear, not yet, but recognition, the kind that comes when a man realizes the rules he has lived by do not apply where he stands now. Behind him, Ellis spoke again, softer this time, almost to himself. "She said my name like she used to when I was a boy," he whispered, and Jonah cursed under his breath, low and tight, because whatever they were hearing, whatever was reaching them, it was not random, it was chosen, shaped, personal in a way that no threat ever needed to be. Ethan opened his hand once more and looked at the tooth, and this time he did not see gold, did not see value. He saw something unfinished, something waiting to be put back into a place that had not stopped existing just because it had been disturbed. And as he lifted his gaze again toward that low rise, he understood, not fully, not yet, but enough to know that whatever stood out there was not coming closer. It was standing exactly where it needed to be, and it was him who had been moving the entire time. The ground did not change beneath Ethan's boots, not in any way that could be measured or proven, but something in the way it held him felt different, firmer, like it had decided he was no longer just passing through. And that realization settled deeper than any fear he had known before, because fear could be outrun, but this felt like belonging to something he had never agreed to. He drew a slow breath, the kind a man takes before stepping into cold water, and for the first time since the night had turned, he did not look to the others, did not wait for Jonah to speak or Ellis to whisper or Mara to warn. He only looked ahead, toward that rise in the land that no longer felt like distance but like direction. "Where we found him," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, and Mara gave the smallest nod, not approval, not permission, just acknowledgement, like a truth finally spoken out loud. Behind them, the lantern inside flickered once, then dimmed further, and Jonah shifted his weight, uneasy, caught between the instinct to follow and the instinct to stay, the kind of hesitation that comes when a man realizes the path forward is not about survival, but about understanding. "You are not thinking of walking out there," Jonas said, his voice low, careful, like speaking too loudly might draw something closer. But Ethan did not turn, did not answer right away, because the answer had already begun forming the moment he stopped seeing the tooth as something he owned. "It is already here," Ethan said finally, and that was the truth none of them could step around anymore. Ellis made a small sound behind them, not quite a word, just the kind of breath that carries fear without naming it, and he backed a step toward the doorway, toward what little light remained. But even that light now felt thinner, weaker, like it was losing ground inch by inch. Mara stepped forward then, just one pace, and the night seemed to part around her, not in movement, but in presence, like something unseen chose not to press against her the way it pressed against everything else. "You cannot carry it there the way you took it," she said, her voice steady, "or it will not listen." Ethan glanced down at his hand, at the way his fingers curled around the tooth without thought, and slowly, deliberately, he opened them, letting the cold weight rest in his palm without grip, without claim, and for a brief moment, the air shifted, just enough that he felt at ease, like a pressure loosening by a fraction. "Then how?" he asked, and Mara's eyes held his, not harsh, not soft, just certain. "You return it the way it was meant to be held," she said, "not by your hand, but by your choice." The word stayed with him as he stepped forward, one foot, then another, leaving the edge of the porch behind, moving into that open stretch where the land felt both familiar and entirely changed, and with each step, the silence deepened, not empty, but full of something watching, something waiting without urgency. Behind him, Jonah cursed quietly again but did not follow, and Ellis stayed where he was, pressed against the doorway, caught between the world he knew and the one unfolding in front of him. Ethan did not look back, not because he was brave, but because he understood now that this was not a path anyone could walk for him. And as he moved closer to that rise, now no more than 15 yards ahead, he began to hear it again, not a voice this time, not a name, but something quieter, something like breath that did not belong to lungs, steady, patient, as if it had been there long before he arrived and would remain long after he was gone. He slowed as he reached the edge of the rise, the ground sloping gently upward, and there, in the dim outline of night, he saw the place where the sand had once been disturbed, now smooth again, untouched to the eye, but not to whatever lay beneath it, and for a long moment, he stood there, the tooth resting open in his palm, understanding at last that this was never about taking or keeping. It was about whether a man could recognize the moment he needed to give something back, not because he was told to, not because he was forced, but because the weight of it had already begun to change him. The rise was not high, no more than 3 feet from base to crest, but as Ethan stepped onto it, the ground seemed to resist in a way that had nothing to do with weight, like the earth itself was asking a question he had not yet answered. And for a moment he stopped, not because he was unsure of his footing, but because he understood that the next step was not about distance anymore, it was about intent. The tooth lay open in his palm, still, silent, yet heavier than it had ever been, and the air around him shifted again, not colder, not warmer, just closer, like something unseen had drawn a circle and he had just crossed into it. Behind him, the porch light flickered once more, and though he did not turn, he knew the others were watching. Jonah with his jaw set tight, Ellis with his breath held somewhere between fear and disbelief, and Mara standing where the night refused to press against her, steady as the line between what was taken and what must be returned. Ethan lowered his gaze to the ground at the crest, where the sand looked untouched, smooth in a way that spoke of time passing without disturbance, yet something beneath it felt present, aware, not buried, not gone, just waiting without demand. He crouched slowly, boots pressing into the slope, and for the first time since this night had begun, he let go of the need to understand every piece of it, because understanding had brought him here, and it had not been enough. The breath he heard before returned, faint but steady, not around him, but within the space itself, like the land was remembering how to speak without words. Ethan extended his hand, not lowering the tooth yet, just holding it there above the surface. And as he did, the silence deepened again, not empty, but attentive, like the pause before something is acknowledged. "I took it," he said quietly, the words simple, stripped of excuse or defense, and they settled into the air without echo, without resistance, as if they had been expected. Nothing moved. Nothing answered. But something shifted, just enough that he felt it in his chest, a slight easing, a fraction of weight lifting from a place he had not known was burdened. He hesitated then, not out of doubt, but because he realized this was not about placing the tooth back into the ground. Not yet. It was about placing himself in the moment where taking had become giving, and that was not a motion of the hand, it was a decision. Behind him, Ellis let out a quiet sound, almost like relief, though nothing had changed in a way he could see, and Jonah shifted again, restless, caught between stepping forward and staying back, but neither of them spoke, because whatever was happening now did not belong to them. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not long enough to escape the moment, just long enough to feel it fully, the weight in his hand, the stillness in the air, the presence. Beneath the ground that did not demand, did not threaten, only waited for what had been disturbed to be set right. When he opened them again, the land looked the same, the rise no different, the night unchanged, and yet everything felt aligned in a way it had not before, like a line drawn crooked had finally been straightened. Slowly, carefully, he lowered his hand, bringing the tooth closer to the surface, not pressing it down, not forcing it into place, just offering it back. And as it neared the ground, the air shifted once more, softer now, like something that had been holding steady had begun to release. The breath faded, not gone, but quieter, less urgent, and Ethan understood then that this was not the end of anything, not yet, but it was the first moment where the balance had begun to return, not because he had been told to do it, not because he had been made to, but because he had chosen to stop holding what was never his to keep. The moment the tooth touched the surface, the night changed, not with sound, not with movement, but with a release so subtle it could have been mistaken for imagination. Yet Ethan felt it run through him like a breath he had been holding without knowing. And for the first time since stepping out into that dark, the air did not press against him. It simply existed again. He did not push the tooth into the ground, did not bury it, did not force it into place. He let it rest there, balanced between his fingers and the earth, as if waiting for the land itself to decide whether to take it back. And in that stillness, something answered, not with a voice, but with a shift, a settling, like a weight finding its rightful place after being carried too far. The surface beneath his hand softened, not visibly, not enough for the eye to follow, but enough that the tooth eased downward on its own, disappearing into the sand without resistance, without disturbance, leaving no mark, no trace, only the memory of where it had been. Ethan held his hand there a moment longer, empty now, feeling the absence of that cold weight, and it struck him then how much of himself had been tied to it in those few short hours, how easily a man could mistake possession for control. Behind him, the porch light steadied, the weak flame inside the lantern finding its shape again, and the line between light and dark returned to something familiar, something that obeyed the rules he had known all his life. He stood slowly, his knees stiff from the crouch, and as he straightened, the rise beneath his feet felt like nothing more than dirt again, just another part of the land, no longer holding that quiet tension that had drawn him forward. The breath that had lingered in the air faded completely, not retreating, not vanishing, just no longer present in the way it had been, and in its place came the smallest stir of wind, brushing across his face, carrying with it the dry scent of earth and distance, the kind of wind that belonged to open country and long roads. Ethan turned then, not hurried, not cautious, just turning, and the sight of the porch, of Jonah and Ellis standing there, of Mara just beyond them, felt grounded again, real in a way it had not been minutes before. Ellis stepped forward first, hesitant, his eyes searching Ethan's face for something he could not name, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, steadier than before. "Is it done?" he asked, and Ethan paused, not because he did not know the answer, but because the word done did not quite fit what had happened. "It is not mine anymore," Ethan said instead, and that felt closer to the truth than anything else he could have said. Jonah let out a long breath, the kind a man releases after holding himself together too tight for too long, and he stepped down from the porch, his boots hitting the ground with a sound that felt normal again, solid, expected. "Then we leave," Jonas said. But there was less urgency in it now, less fear, more habit, like returning to a rhythm that had been interrupted but not broken. Mara watched Ethan as he walked back toward them, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her eyes now, not approval, not relief, just recognition, like she had seen this moment before in a different form, with different people, and it had ended the same way. As Ethan reached the edge of the porch, he glanced once more over his shoulder, back toward the rise, but there was nothing there now, no shape, no pull, just land, stretching out under the night sky the way it always had, quiet and endless. And yet, as he turned away from it, he understood that something had shifted in him as well, something that would not return to what it had been, because the line between taking and returning had become clearer than any trail he had ever followed, and out here, that line mattered more than any map a man could carry. The porch felt different when Ethan stepped onto it again, not because it had changed, but because he had, and the boards beneath his boots no longer carried that quiet tension that had followed him out into the dark. They creaked the way wood always had, honest, familiar, unburdened by anything beyond their own weight. Jonah moved past him without a word, heading inside as if putting walls between himself and the open land might help settle what he could not name, and Ellis lingered near the edge, his eyes drifting back and forth between Ethan and the rise in the distance, as though expecting something to return, something to prove that what they had felt was not over yet. Mara remained where she was, just off the porch, her presence steady, unchanged, like she belonged equally to the space they stood in and the land beyond it. "You listened," she said after a moment, her voice calm, almost quiet enough to be missed, and Ethan glanced at her, not with pride, not with relief, just with a kind of understanding that had not been there before. "I stopped not listening," he replied, and that seemed to settle something between them, something unspoken but acknowledged. Inside, the lantern burned steadier now, casting light that reached all the way to the corners of the room again, and the shadows behaved as they should, staying where they were cast, no longer shifting on their own. Jonah poured himself a drink with hands that still carried a trace of tension, though he tried to hide it, and Ellis followed him in, closing the door behind him as if sealing the night outside where it belonged. Ethan stepped in last, pausing just long enough to take one more look at the open land. But there was nothing there now, nothing watching, nothing waiting, just the quiet stretch of earth under a sky that had returned to its usual distance. When he shut the door, the sound felt final in a way he could not explain, not like ending something, but like completing it. For a while, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because words felt smaller than what had passed between them, and each man seemed content to sit with his own thoughts, letting them settle in their own time. Ellis broke the silence first, his voice hesitant but clearer than before. "It felt like it knew me," he said, staring down at his hands as if expecting to see something there. Like it was not just calling, it was remembering. Jonah nodded once, slow, his eyes fixed on the table. "Same here," he admitted, though he did not elaborate, and he did not need to, because the meaning sat heavy in the room already. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the absence in his palms still noticeable, not painful, not empty, just different, like a weight that had shaped him while it was there and left its mark when it was gone. "It was not after us," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "It was after what we carried." Mara stepped just inside the doorway, not fully entering, but close enough that her presence was felt again, and she inclined her head slightly. "And now," she said, "it does not need to follow." The words settled into the room, not as a warning, not as comfort, but as truth, and for the first time since the night had begun, the silence that followed felt like rest instead of tension. Outside, the wind moved again, soft and steady, brushing against the walls in a way that belonged to the world they knew, and inside, the lantern held its light, without struggle. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to mark the difference, to feel the space where something had been and understand why it had mattered. And when he opened them again, the room was just a room, the night just a night. But the line he had crossed out there in the dark remained clear in his mind, not as a memory of fear, but as a lesson he would carry longer than any piece of gold he had ever held. Morning came slowly, not with the sharp edge of sunrise cutting across the land, but with a soft gray light that seemed to rise out of the ground itself, spreading across Dry Creek in a way that felt earned rather than given. And when Ethan stepped outside, the air carried that familiar dryness again, the kind that spoke of long days and longer miles, not of anything watching from beyond sight. The rise in the distance looked smaller now, no more than a natural shift in the land, something a man could pass without notice if he had not already learned what waited there when it was disturbed. And for a long moment, Ethan stood on the porch, hands resting at his sides, feeling the absence of the tooth not as loss, but as space, like a weight removed had left room for something steadier to take its place. Jonah joined him a minute later, hat pulled low, eyes narrowed against the growing light, and he followed Ethan's gaze without asking, without needing to, because some things did not require explanation once they had been lived through. "Looks the same," Jonah said, his voice quieter than usual, and Ethan gave a small nod. "It is the same," he replied. Then after a pause, "We are not." That seemed to settle between them without argument, the kind of truth that did not need to be proven, only carried. Ellis stepped out last, slower than the others, his movements careful, like he was still adjusting to a world that had shifted beneath him overnight. And he looked out toward the land with a different kind of attention now, not searching, not fearing, just aware in a way he had not been before. "I thought I would still hear it," he admitted, almost to himself, and Ethan glanced at him, then back at the open stretch of earth. "You might," he said, "but not like before." Ellis frowned slightly, but did not press, and that was enough. Mara stood a few yards off the porch, her presence as quiet as ever, watching the morning settle in with the same steady gaze she had carried through the night. And when Ethan stepped down to join her, she did not greet him, did not question him. She only looked at him long enough to see what had changed. "You gave it back," she said, and Ethan shook his head once slow. "I stopped holding it," he answered, and something in her expression shifted then, not a smile, not approval, just a recognition that matched what she had seen before in others who had learned the same lesson in different ways. "The land does not keep score the way men do," she said, her voice carrying that same calm certainty. "It only remembers when something is out of place." Ethan looked out again, at the wide stretch of earth that now felt open instead of watching, and he let that settle in, the idea that nothing had been taken from him last night, only returned to where it had always belonged. Behind them, Jonah called out that the horses were ready, his tone returning to something closer to habit, though still edged with thought, and Ellis moved to help, his steps steadier now, more certain with each movement. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but out of respect, letting the quiet of the morning sink in fully before he turned away. When he finally stepped toward the others, the sound of his boots on the dry ground felt familiar again, grounded, part of the world he knew. And as he reached for the reins of his horse, he paused just once, glancing back toward the rise, not expecting anything to be there, not fearing it either, just acknowledging it, the way a man acknowledges a place that has taught him something he will not forget. Then he mounted up, settled into the saddle, and with a small nudge forward, he rode out with the others into a morning that carried no shadows chasing behind them, only the quiet understanding that some things out here did not belong to those who found them. And a man was measured not by what he could take, but by what he knew to leave alone. They rode in silence for the first mile, not because there was nothing to say, but because each man carried something that words would only disturb, and the rhythm of hooves against dry earth felt like the only thing that belonged to the morning. The land stretched wide around them, open and familiar, yet Ethan noticed the way he watched it now, not searching for value, not measuring distance in terms of gain, but reading it for what it was, a place that held its own order whether men understood it or not. Jonah rode slightly ahead, his posture steady but his shoulders still carrying a trace of the night before, the kind that does not leave a man all at once, and Ella stayed a little behind, glancing from side to side, as if expecting something to step out from between the low brush and scattered rock, though nothing did, not even a shift of shadow where it did not belong. The wind moved lightly across the plain, brushing against their coats and hats, carrying the dry scent of dust and distance. And for the first time since the sun had come up, it felt like the world was breathing without restraint. Ethan adjusted his grip on the reins, his hands steady, but his thoughts slower than usual, not dulled, just deliberate, as if each one had to pass through a place inside him that had not been there before. He did not look back at the rise, not because he feared it, but because he no longer needed to. The lesson it held had already moved with him, settled somewhere deeper than memory. "You ever think about how easy it is," Jonah said after a while, his voice cutting into the quiet without breaking it, "to mistake something for yours just because no one stops you from taking it?" Ethan considered that, the words landing in a way that felt less like a question and more like a truth being tested out loud. "Most men do not wait to be stopped," he said, his tone even, not defensive, not distant, just honest. "They take silence as permission." Jonah let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, not quite agreement, and shook his head slightly, as if the thought sat heavier than he expected. Ellis leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes fixed on the ground ahead of them, tracking nothing in particular, but paying attention in a way that suggested he had learned something about what could not be seen. "It knew things," he said quietly, almost reluctant to speak it again. "Things it should not have known." Ethan glanced at him briefly, then back ahead, the horizon steady and wide. "It did not know," he said. "It remembered." The distinction settled between them, and no one challenged it, because it fit too well with what each of them had felt, that sense of being seen not as they stood now, but as they had been at some point they thought was long behind them. They rode another half-mile before the buildings of Dry Creek began to take shape in the distance, low structures against the open land, smoke rising from a chimney or two, the kind of sight that usually meant return, familiarity, something unchanged. But Ethan knew now that return did not mean the same thing it had before, not after a night that had drawn a line he could not step back across. As they approached, a few townsfolk moved about their morning routines, glancing up as the riders came in, but nothing in their expressions suggested they knew anything of what had passed beyond the edge of town, and that felt right somehow, like certain things were not meant to travel beyond the ground where they happened. Ethan slowed his horse slightly, letting the others draw even with him, and as they entered the quiet street, he felt the weight of the place settle in around him again, not as a burden, but as something he now understood better. He did not speak as they dismounted, did not try to shape what had happened into something smaller, something easier to carry, because he knew now that some things were not meant to be explained, only remembered in the way a man carries a line he has crossed and chooses not to cross again, not because he fears what waits beyond it, but because he finally understands why it is there. The town carried on as if nothing had shifted, as if the night before had never stretched beyond its usual bounds. And that was the way of places like Dry Creek, where the land kept its deeper truths to itself, and men learned to live in the parts they could see. Ethan tied his horse to the post outside the saloon, the leather reins rough against his hand in a way that felt grounding, familiar, and for a moment he stood there without moving, watching the dust drift slowly across the street, catching the morning light in small, quiet patterns that held no meaning beyond themselves. Jonah pushed through the saloon doors ahead of him, the wood swinging back with a tired creak, and Ellis followed, slower, glancing once over his shoulder as if expecting something to still be there beyond the edge of town. But there was nothing, only open land stretching out under a sky that gave no sign of what it had held just hours before. Inside, the room smelled of coffee and old wood, of something lived in and repeated day after day, and the sound of a chair scraping against the floor felt steady, real, like the world had settled back into its usual shape. Ethan stepped in last, letting the doors fall closed behind him, and for a moment he simply listened, to the low murmur of voices, to the clink of a cup being set down, to the ordinary rhythm of a place that had not changed, even if he had. He took a seat near the window, not out of habit, but because it gave him a line of sight back toward the land, and though he did not expect to see anything there, he found himself watching anyway, not out of fear, but out of respect for what he now knew existed beyond what most men noticed. Jonah sat across from him, his movements slower than usual, as if each action carried a weight he had not yet set down, and Ellis took the seat beside him, his hands resting flat on the table, steady, but not idle. "We do not talk about it," Jonah said after a moment, his voice low, not commanding, but certain, and Ethan looked at him, considering the words, the way they were shaped not by denial, but by understanding. "There is nothing to tell," Ethan replied, and that felt true, because what had happened out there did not belong to stories or explanations. It belonged to the kind of knowing that sat beneath words. Ellis nodded slightly, as if that answer eased something in him, and he reached for the cup in front of him, his fingers steady now, no longer searching for something unseen. The door opened again behind them, and a man stepped in from the street, his boots carrying the same dust they had ridden through, his eyes scanning the room in the way of someone looking for news, for something worth hearing, and for a brief moment, Ethan wondered what he would say if asked, how he would shape the night into something that could be understood by someone who had not stood on that rise, who had not felt the weight of something that did not belong to him settle into his hand. But the thought passed as quickly as it came, because he knew now that some things were not meant to be carried into places like this, not because they were hidden, but because they did not need to be shared to remain real. Mara did not enter the saloon, did not follow them into the space of wood and voices and routine, but Ethan felt her presence somewhere beyond the walls, not watching, not waiting, just part of the land that had already returned to its balance. He leaned back in his chair, the light from the window falling across his hands, and for the first time since the night had begun, they felt entirely his again, not holding anything that was not meant to be there, not carrying any weight that needed to be returned. Outside, the wind moved through the street, lifting a thin veil of dust that caught the sunlight before settling again, and in that small, ordinary motion, Ethan saw something he had not noticed before, not a sign, not a warning, just a reminder that the world did not change to match a man's understanding. It remained what it was, and it was the man who chose whether to see it clearly or not. The day stretched on the way it always did in Dry Creek, slow and sunlit, with the kind of quiet that settled into the bones of the town and stayed there until dusk, and by afternoon, nothing remained of the night before except what each man carried within himself, unseen, unspoken, but not forgotten. Ethan stepped out of the saloon as the sun began its slow descent, the light turning warmer, longer, casting shadows that behaved the way shadows should, tied to the shape of things, not moving on their own, not reaching beyond their place. He stood there for a moment, hat tilted back slightly, eyes tracing the line where the buildings gave way to open land, and though there was nothing waiting there now, no presence pressing against the edge of sight, he did not look away quickly. He let his gaze rest, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging. Behind him, the sound of the door closing marked Jonah's exit, followed by the steady steps of Ellis, both men moving with a kind of quiet awareness that had not been there before, as if each had learned something about the space around them that could not be unlearned. "You heading out?" Jonah asked, adjusting his hat as he glanced toward Ethan, and the question carried no urgency, no expectation, just the simple rhythm of men deciding where the rest of their day would take them. Ethan considered it for a moment, not because he did not know, but because he understood now that where a man went mattered less than how he walked once he got there. "Not far," he said, his voice even, grounded, and that was enough. Ellis nodded once, then turned toward the stables, his steps steady, his gaze no longer drifting to places that did not need to be watched. Mara stood at the far end of the street, where the last building gave way to open earth, her figure still, her presence quiet as ever, and when Ethan met her eyes from across that distance, there was no need for words, no need for gesture, only a shared understanding that what had been set out of place had been returned, and that was all that had ever been required. He walked toward her slowly, boots pressing into the dry ground with a sound that felt honest, real, and when he reached the edge of town, he stopped beside her, not stepping past, not crossing into the open land again, not because he feared it, but because he respected the line that had made itself known. "It stays quiet now," he said, more observation than question, and Mara inclined her head slightly. "It was always quiet," she replied. "You just could not hear it before." Ethan let that settle, the idea that silence was not emptiness, but presence without demand, and he looked out once more at the stretch of land beyond, seeing it not as something to be claimed or measured, but as something that existed in its own right, with its own balance, its own memory. The sun dipped lower, the light softening, and the first hint of evening began to gather, but there was no tension in it now, no weight pressing against the coming dark, only the steady rhythm of a day ending the way it was meant to. Ethan tipped his hat slightly, not to Mara alone, but to the land itself, a gesture, small enough to go unnoticed by most, but meaningful in a way he did not need to explain. And then he turned back toward the town, toward the life he knew, carrying with him nothing more than the understanding that out here, justice did not ride in loud or fast. It did not come with force or demand. It arrived in the quiet moment when a man chose to set something right, and once it was done, it did not follow him. It simply stayed where it belonged, leaving him to walk on with a little less weight than before.